Good evening, comparativists. Welcome back to CompGov Command, going nation by nation. And today we're going to do a deep dive into the political players and systems of Nigeria. So let's head on over to West Africa. Let's get it. All right. Right off the top, if you've been listening to them in order and watching them in order, you know that we just did Mexico last episode, which means that we're still on the Federal Republic tip. And that means these governments feature presidents as the head of state and government. And so we get to Mr. Tinubu, currently repping the APC, the All Progressives Congress. He is the central figure in policy making right now in Nigeria, but as it is a federal system with states with their own governors, as he himself was formerly governor of Lagos State, he understands that regional interests often come into play. And as you get into different regions of Nigeria, as I'm sure you studied, thinking about the north, where you have, a lot of individuals who are Fulani speaking Hausa there, and in the southwest, you have probably a dominant Yoruba area, and in the southeast, a dominant Igbo area, among dozens and dozens of other language groups and interest groups there, as well as ethnic identities. Ethnic interests will come into play as well. So understand, and this is exactly what federal republics are designed to do. They are designed to allow for there to be some sort of regional autonomy so that individuals living in different diverse localities can craft policy that best suits their needs where they are, while also not straying too far from an overarching national government, right? This is what is distinctive from the unitary parliamentary system, which has one law that sort of functions almost the same throughout the entire country. You do get some regional flavor with your law, which matches different cultural and economic and geographic dispositions. So, that being said, it is one of the newer countries being sort of freed by their colonial masters, the UK, in 1960, and only really getting into their more modern republic system of democracy right there in 1999. And so, not quite coalesced to be as stable as we'd like, although it has gone ahead and crossed some major thresholds, which we'll talk about as we move through. So, kind of a fragile system in the fact that it's new and it's still going through some growing pains. And the key is this strong president figure who's trying to establish the importance of a national concept as well as application of rule of law throughout all of Nigeria. Now, right now, like I said, it's the All Progressives Congress, which are in the driver's seat. In the most recent iteration of the newest republic, when the military called time in from a long time out with no democratic government because of the violence that was popping off as a result of these very contentious elections that were taking place during the 80s. When we get to the 90s again, the first party to kind of get some run was the PDP, the People's Democratic Party. You had everyone from President Obasanjo all the way through up to Good Luck Jonathan, who actually loses his reelection bid to Mr. Buhari from the APC. And then the whole world kind of watched like, oh, cringe. Are they going to go back into violence? Is the military going to come separate the two groups and push them away from each other and call a timeout on democracy again? But no, there's a peaceful transfer of power between the APC leadership and the PDP. And the whole world was like, oh, exhale, like everything's all good. More recently, with the election of Mr. Tinubu, it was very contentious because a third party manifested almost out of thin air, led by one Peter Obi, calling itself the Labour Party, going back to its DNA as a former UK colony, right? Shout out to, I guess, um, Keir Starmer, who was doing okay, I guess. Could be doing better, could be doing worse. Um, And we'll see in the next election cycle, when Tinubu runs for election, will Peter Obi run again? And then will we have gone from a two-party to a three-party, multi-party system? So interesting things unfolding in the evolution of Nigerian party politics there. Um, the key issue had been, will these parties end up being regional and or ethnic and or religious in nature only? And as a result, will the military have to step in often because the parties would simply end up battling each other politically, and it would spill over into ethnic groups clashing physically in the streets with AKs and stuff and Molotovs? Or would the parties grow to start getting more broad appeal outside of just Christians and start attracting Muslim voters? Or vice versa, right? Will parties in the North start getting more appeal and attracting Christians from the South? Or will groups that were formerly, more Yoruba led start attracting support from Igbo and other groups in the Southeast, or I should say, Fulani House of Speakers in the North? So, in order to facilitate an even share of political power in these early days of that, the most recent, that Fourth Republic piece, what you see happening is a situation that was informally called zoning, where you switch off between, someone from the North being Muslim, being the leader, and then someone from the South being Christian, and back and forth and back and forth. And that agreement kind of held steady um, until after the defeat of Goodluck Jonathan, where things went topsy turvy. And now, as it stands, you have Mr. Tinubu, governor of Lagos State, in a primarily Christian zone, who was actually a Muslim. So it ended up having two Muslims in a row, but one of them Southern, and it's starting to really get kind of muddled, but in a good way, because the parties are starting to sort of branch out and claim more membership than just people along strict ethnic, regional, or religious lines. I mean, that's a net positive, I think, for the development of parties in Nigeria. I love a little fist right there. Reminds me of the very classic picture of the '68 Mexico City Olympics with John Carlos and Tommy Smith there. Anyway, do you have political activism in Nigeria and social movements? Of course you do. However, because again, they can be tinged with regional grievances, ethnic disputes would have come back in some cases for millennia, right? Nigeria, number one, is not nearly as small geographically as you might think, as it straddles close to the equator. So once you go ahead and look at a website such as like the true size of.net, you start moving things around, you notice how vast it is. You notice, therefore, also how incredibly diverse it is in terms of religious and ethnic diversity. So sometimes these movements can sort of unleash and or pick the scabs of really old grievances based on regional or ethnic sort of problems that persisted ever since way before the formation of the modern nation state of Nigeria, right? um One particular instance that comes to mind, and as we're talking about like civil society, was the very suspect apprehension, trial, and subsequent execution of environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was a member of the Ogoni people living along the Niger River Delta, who witnessed complete and utter devastation because of blowouts were very common, sadly, in oil drilling operations there, as most of the really profitable oil wells are right there off the river delta and the adjacent sea, and or on the delta itself. And formerly he was sent, on a self-imposed exile to the UK, but came back and again was apprehended, tried with some trumped up charges, convicted and killed. And whereas he had led a very sort of, nonviolent environmental protest against the governor of Delta State and all the other forces who were behind pumping as much oil as possible and selling it as, again, spoiler alert, right? We're talking about a resource curse here that's very active in Nigeria as they're attempting to diversify, but they're not nearly as far along in the process as like a Mexico or even as a Russia. Um, Look at the tree map for Nigeria. It's like astounding how much of their exports come in just from oil. But long story short, his death is going to trigger a whole other sort of environmental protest, which is much more active, I'll say, and in a gentle way, and violent, I'll say, in a not so gentle way, in the form of MEND, which is the group that's pushing for technically what it stands for is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. So, um, again, his complete, kangaroo court trial that found him guilty of a crime. And you look at the details on this, like it would have required him to be in two places simultaneously for him to have committed this crime that they claim that he did. So it just highlights the complete lack of civil liberties there. As just like Mexico, the Freedom House folks sort Nigeria as a partly free nation, still trying to improve those rankings. And again, it's just a matter of who does the state favor and who does the national government favor in that situation. Oil interests and all the revenue that they bring in, right, to help pay for services and development infrastructure, and also just to line their own pockets, right? Or do they favor the individual rights to exist and the freedoms of local populations? Um, if you want to get even more militant, but switch from the South in Christian territory and head up north, you can talk about Boko Haram, a group founded by radical cleric Muhammad Yusuf, that was, essentially designed to reject how westernized that southern part of Nigeria was becoming, right? If you're looking at Nigeria, it's a tale of two different nations kind of stapled together, right? Um, you had for many hundreds of years, off and on, coherent Islamic rule in that northern part, which is Savannah and Sahel dominated. And most recently, before the formation of Nigeria and the arrival of the British, something called the Sokoto Caliphate, right? Whereas in the south, where you get to the more regular grasslands and forested areas as you approach like down by the delta, right? You had a much more fragmented society dominated by a few large groups, such as the aforementioned Yoruba and the Igbo, right? And what you began to see was that as the North seemed to be more cohesive, with Islam forming a glue of sorts to bind those folks together culturally, um, the British went ahead and ran an indirect rule and said, you all can just run your affairs there while we administer more to the people along the coast here that we can relate to, who share more cultural DNA with us because they're Christian as we are, due to experience to other missionaries before who came from other countries traveling along the coast of Africa. Um, and then, of course, when once they discover there's oil wealth there, then of course they're going to bed down right there along the coast. And places like Lagos are going to blow up, and like Port Harcourt, other places like that overnight, in terms of development by British companies and everything. And so, as a way to reject the westernization of some parts of Nigeria, Boko Haram, which technically means like Western education is forbidden, um, that's basically occasionally off and on launched an assault on the Nigerian government in an attempt to take over some of the northern states, particularly Borno State, right there, which is adjacent to Lake Chad at the very top northeastern corner of the country. And in some cases, actually launched assaults on the brand spanking new capital of Abuja, right there in the middle belt, only to be repulsed which again shows the strength of the Nigerian government. Um, but at the same time, they're still a threat, and it seems like every decade or so, there's a major debacle in which many Nigerian young women are basically captured and taken north for all manner of purposes, everything from becoming forced wives into arranged marriages, all the way to possibly being indoctrinated and brainwashed into becoming human bombs, basically. So anyway, bottom line is, yes, Nigeria is chock full of activism, sometimes due to outside forces threatening the sovereignty of the nation, sometimes due to individuals who are frustrated with national policy. And it can get bad quickly, particularly because of the relative weakness of some institutions, although they are getting stronger, right? As the more we see elections, uh, being attended and being participated in large numbers of Nigerians, and we see peaceful transfers of power that further legitimize the new leadership as it changes hands. Those institutions will get stronger, but what we also see is that there's vast inequality in terms of the economics of both the southern and northern parts of Nigeria. There is revenue sharing between them, an attempt to ameliorate that a little bit, and an attempt to make a middle zone between the two, which is relatively equal Christian Muslim, with the attempt to put Abuja, the capital there, to see it as a center for governance for all Nigerians, and moving the power away from Lagos politically, although Lagos still tends to be the economic powerhouse, and it will continue to be so in the future as it's becoming one of the large West African megacities, along with places like Luanda and Angola and so on. What we have is a National Assembly, a Congress of sorts, based kind of on the American model. And you thinking to yourself, that's interesting, because being a UK sort of possession for such a long time, wouldn't they run a parliament first? And they tried that, but again, the federal republic system works better for large, ethnically and economically and culturally, even geographically diverse regions. And they just went ahead and switched to that model, and it just seems to be working better for them. There's upper chamber that they call the Senate, a lower chamber called the House of Reps, just like we have here in America, and the elections are fairly competitive. That's not to say, however, that certain people with outsized amounts of wealth can't, attempt to use their influence to buy votes, or if they have large amounts of weapons, to threaten to use violence to sway voters. It's also difficult to go ahead and get all these ballots out to people who speak literally dozens of languages inside the country. They're using English now as like the lingua franca inside of the country. But oftentimes you'll see road signs that have, multiple languages, and that makes things sort of difficult. The big story, and it kind of goes back to what we saw with Mexico around 1999, 2000, is essentially the military was looking around at the political landscape and thought, okay, it's time to tag democracy back in, right? And start the timer and hit play on the DVR of Nigerian government and let restart elections. And it actually has worked out relatively well since. The first president in that cycle, President Obasanjo, was actually a former military leader. And it's an interesting thing when the person who had a hand in creating military rule for most of the 80s then retires from the military and swaps his uniform for a suit and then runs as a civilian and is a very successful president. Um, you got to think that Obasanjo's got to be like on a proverbial Nigerian Mount Rushmore. His face has got to be up there. Um, and one big thing that's happened as well along the way is that just like it can with Mexico, right? Because we're talking about a nation that had the military had instituted nationalized steel mills and oil facilities. You know, you have Pemex is to Mexico, as the NNPC is to Nigeria, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, right? So what you basically have there is the same kind of blueprint where the West isn't going to start to invest large amounts of money in them until they start to open up and allow for more privatization and allow for more foreign investment directly into Nigerian firms. So that's been sort of going on. And if you're looking at certain stats, like there's certain graphs you'll see in the course that show you the amount of like loans taken on, the amount of total debt to the IMF and the World Bank, you know, spiking more recently for Nigeria as they're taking on more funds to address some of these challenges, particularly that weak infrastructure piece. Um, there are some Nigerians that live very well in cosmopolitan condominiums in Lagos that is as good of real estate as anywhere else on the planet. They drive Benzes, they're college educated with advanced degrees, all that stuff. And there are other Nigerians still living in pastoral huts and whatnot that are herding cattle up in the Sahel. The vast disparity of lifestyles there. And so in trying to build out infrastructure to get more just basic stuff like electricity and plumbing and internet, things like that out there. They do need some help with that for sure. um, as a result, you really can't without that infrastructure. And Mexico faces the similar problem, right? And they're working to address this in some of the poorer states. Without roads and without telecom that's consistent going out to these places, without internet, it's hard for the state to project its ability to rule properly, which limits state capacity there. Um, if they were to build up this infrastructure and their state presence throughout all the rural sections and rural states of Nigeria, you would see a much greater unification of this South Nigeria, which is oil wealthy, and this sort of more rural, more culturally rich situation in North Nigeria. And that's why that middle belt is so crucial. They got to get that done. Um, I've seen other nations try to move their capitals for political purposes, and Abuja has real potential. And like I said, they already repelled multiple attacks on it from Boko Haram, and it's held strong. But it's got to keep growing. It's the second, I think, it's the second largest city in Nigeria now, and it's growing. And it will never quite be Lagos because Lagos is already on the map as like a major world city. But it needs to grow in prominence and be seen as a symbol of that unity of the north and the south of the country. Who runs stuff? I don't know. Maybe I should have put informal power ahead of formal power here. Yes, we talked about the role of the president. We talked about the national government, but we cannot forget about the OGAs. For millennia, there have been local and ethnic and tribal authorities, individuals who have garnered much respect, who have been able to throw around influence to make decisions among these regional and these ethnic groups. And it's not like they lose all their power completely just because there's a new national power structure in play. No, it's oftentimes Nigerians feel tension between, well, I mean, who really has more influence on me, this relatively new federal government situation, or the people that individuals in my town have listened to for literally thousands of years. And in many cases, the more enterprising ogas have been attempting to go ahead and basically run for public office to kind of stack their influence and become more formal. And in other cases, many individuals who have become elected officials have attempted to wield power in more informal, traditional ways akin to some ogas. So it's a very interesting power dynamic happening here where those people who have been flexing power in the old Nigerian ways are dabbling in these new methods vis-a-vis elective office and vice versa. And an interesting blend of characters is emerging. But in some cases, some of them end up basically forming very powerful, just like we saw in Mexico, very powerful patron client relationships. Um, One of the key individuals to bring up here, speaking of people who were political patrons who served oil clients and got kickbacks from these oil clients, would be the former disgraced governor of Delta State, James Abori. One of the few state governors to actually be convicted of corruption. Well, simply because he took a lot of his wealth and brought it over to Barclays Bank in the UK and got caught there by UK officials. That's the sad truth. As a Oga, as a state governor, he would have probably been charged, but they would have just slapped him on the wrist or something like that, and he wouldn't actually have faced much jail time, if at all, for that crime in Nigeria. So, as we see in these situations of PCR, of patron client relationships, power is divided between people where it should be really centralized in some cases, and these strange negotiations between the parties exist such that they basically become cooperative. And, like, for instance, if you were a Delta state and you were running an oil operation and you were doing all sorts of terrible environmental deeds to cut costs, and people like men were messing with you, wouldn't you like to go ahead possibly and lean in on the Delta State governor to provide you with some military muscle or some means to go ahead and spread some disinformation about men to weaken their reputation in Delta State? I mean, you would. And that's like the science, the economic sort of skill that comes along with exploitation, right? You make these power networks and you scratch each other's backs, right, to maintain that income and maintain that influence. Um, the same story we saw with Mexico is what we're going to see here, and we're going to see an interesting sort of PCR situation between um, the oil industry and technocrats and the IRGC when we get to Iran, and we look at that next video. But moving on, let's do a little review of the history, right? Like we talked about, by the British being indirect and not trying to intervene directly and trying to solve this beef between the various sections of Nigeria, simply allowing it to exist in the status quo when it was happening and just using it to extract resources to benefit the UK. When they make the country in 1960 independent, it comes inherent with all of those same issues. As a result, their early years of their democracy are very fraught. They attempt to draft multiple constitutions and start multiple republics. In many cases, the military intervenes. In one case, the Igbo tried to lead an actual civil war and form a new sovereign state called Biafra. It failed. A lot of really bad blood and blood spilt during the mid 60s to 70s. They try again in the 70s. It fails. The military gets back in charge again throughout most of the 80s. And finally, in 99, they try to go ahead and form a civilian government. And it actually worked, which is wild if you think about it. We often think in the West that the military is a threat to democracy, but Nigeria proves maybe in the long run the military can safeguard democracy. I don't know. It's wild, but it seems like it. Especially when you look at it even in parts of American history, right? George Washington's a military figure who safeguarded democracy, right? So it can happen. It can happen. It's not what we tend to think happens, as we built our entire constitution on the premise that we need to have rights to defend ourselves against military oppression and keep the military out of our homes, right? And keep the military from searching through all of our stuff, which is the basis of many of the amendments of the Bill of Rights. But in this case, we see a situation where the military were good stewards. They did actually mean what they were saying about eventually returning to civilian democratic rule. And so far, it's been going pretty well. Again, big shout out goes to our favorite name in the entire course, our good friend, former President Good Luck Jonathan, who does not call for any military intervention when he loses to Muhammadu Buhari of the APC in 2015. He's like, all right, it was a good run. Go ahead, Buhari, you got this. And again, what a major moment. Anytime you see a peaceable transfer of party power between and the regime change happens like that quickly, that's a beautiful thing. That's a sign of maturity in a democracy for sure. And right now, again, Nigeria is trying to grow. Mr. Tinubu has a dream to become $1 trillion GDP nation relatively soon. They're about 40% of the way there, but they're doing it a lot of the way through rentier state economics based on oil sales. So developing other different sectors of the economy while also maintaining security such that all these new developments might trigger some in the north to feel like, wait, we're getting too westernized. That might lead to a revival of Boko Haram. So we need to protect against that, while also growing economically as fast as possible in an environmentally sustainable way, so as to keep people such as MEND at bay, so that they won't go ahead and become a proverbial fly in the ointment of this new policy shift. And as the economy grows, you're going to have more people trying to flex political power. So maybe, just maybe, the question will become, well, geez, we need more voice. We need more political choice. So, like we said, maybe it becomes a three-party state, four parties. Who knows what's going to happen in the future of Nigerian politics? But that might cause more volatility. That might tempt some individuals to want to maybe use means to create stability, which kind of go against the grain of all the progress they've been making recently in terms of their democratic development. Here are your themes. One of, if not the most diverse nations in this course. They are resource cursed, and they're very much in it. They're trying to dig out of it, but they're digging out of it and diversifying in their infancy of that. They're nowhere close to Mexico. Although I guess they're not as bad, or maybe kind of as bad as Iran, but Iran has other reasons for that. The sanctions, we'll get to that next video. Because of their relatively, new status as a younger democracy, and as well as their poor infrastructure development, the state is struggling to establish its presence all over the nation, so it has weak state capacity. They're still dealing with centuries of political momentum that leans into corruption, trying to deal with that. And of course, there are many haves and have nots. Although technically, the Gini is actually relatively low for Nigeria just because of the abject poverty that we're looking at here. It is the lowest in terms of per capita GDP of all the nations in this course, about 1/10 of Mexico's, which is pretty tough. But again, some parts of it are just as cosmopolitan as other major cities in the world. They gotta start finding a way to boost the number of middle class, upwardly mobile, educated, literate Nigerians. Could be a lot of questions about the comp between Nigeria's Federal Republic and Mexico's. Maybe you can look at some of that stuff to review there. And again, if you're going to look at this particular nation, identity politics is going to be a big deal, as well as anything involving PCR, patron client relationships. And of course, we're looking at the situation involving import substitution and the gradual shift towards structural adjustment. All right. Um, yeah, and then just some key things you can toss into FRQs right there. A big mention for civil society would be Men to Ken Saro-Wiwa. Um, if you want to get into informal power dynamics, the zoning piece, we leave you with this. Nigeria is a fragile federal democracy where ethnic divisions, resource wealth, and weak institutions create ongoing challenges to stability and governance. And with that, that will wrap things up for Nigeria today. Thank you so much for listening. And when you're watching these, I hope that I'll get better production value later on. I'm trying to just get these out before the AP test for y'all, but I hope that you're putting on like your favorite, maybe instrumental, like lo-fi beats or classical, or maybe some jazz, whatever helps you think, whatever helps you chill, relax, and digest this material, so you can have full command of the CompGov material. Once again, thanks for watching. This has been Mr. Miller. We'll see you next video. Peace.